We'll make a start. Welcome everybody. Really glad that you could join us today for our Virtual Learning Café. My name's Gail Gibbons. I'm going to be chairing the session today, and I'm one of the Assistant Directors of Change at the Youth Endowment Fund with responsibility for children's services, neighbourhoods and the youth sector. I'm super excited for this Virtual Learning Café today about race equity in the children's services sector. We've got two excellent speakers who are extremely experienced in this area. First of all, we've got Nimal Jude, who is Head of Practice Development at Foundations. Many of you will know that Foundations is the What Works Centre for Children and Families. And she's also the co-editor of a recently published book called The Anti-Racist Social Worker in Practice. So we'll be hearing all about her work at Foundations in relation to race equity, and also some things about the book as well, hopefully. And then secondly, we've got Antonia Ogundayisi. Antonia is an anti-racist practice service manager at Essex County Council. She is also a Youth Endowment Fund race equity advisor. And I think it's going to be so interesting to hear from Antonia about how her work, how she operates in practice with that very specialist role, which certainly is not universal across all local authorities and across the country. So they're going to have about half an hour each to present, and then there will be time for question and answer after each of those sessions, and also a little bit of time at the end as well. Just to let you know, we are recording this session, so please feel free to put your cameras on, but we are going to keep you muted. But equally, it's quite okay if you don't want your cameras on, if you don't want to be on screen. And we will be uploading the recording of the session and both sets of slides to the Youth Endowment Fund website after the event. So if you want to access the slides or the recording, please feel free to do so, and also to share them with any colleagues you think might be interested. So without further ado, I shall introduce you to Nimal. Nimal, are you there? Oh, here she is. Brilliant. Over to you, Nimal.
Hi, thank you, Gail, and thanks for inviting myself and Antonia to participate in this Virtual Learning Café. And thanks for the introduction. I've got my sort of talk is in two sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about the day job and practice guides and foundations. And then also I was particularly invited to this session to talk about, as Gail mentioned, the anti-racist social worker in practice. And this is I think this is probably the first time that, things I do outside of work are sort of connecting in with things that I do in work. So I'll try and kind of link them up as best as possible. So I've got some slides to share, which I will do now. Here we go. So some of these I'm going to skim over because you'll get them in the pack. But as Gail said, we are Foundations. I work at Foundations, which is the National Work Centre for Children and Families. So, a sister What Work Centre to YEF. And these are our priority areas. So we try and focus on these areas. As I said, I'm going to skip over some of this. We also have a toolkit, just like YEF. And within that toolkit, there is the guidebook and there are practice guides. And I think this should play so you don't have to listen to my voice all the time. Let me know if you can't hear that, someone.
I can't hear it at the moment, Nimal.
Okay, well, maybe I haven't enabled it, but you can listen to it when you see the slides. I'm going to skip forward. So the guidebook is a list of interventions that you can choose from, and when you watch that video, it's very similar to the YEF guidebook where there's a whole list of interventions with different ratings, and you can search. So I think it's like 130 different types of interventions that you can search. So I'll leave that there because probably this audience will be familiar with that. But just to sort of say, the guidebook is not an endorsement for any specific interventions. And of course, doesn't have everything in it. And it's not a list of quick wins in terms of interventions. But I'm really here to talk a little bit more about practice guides, which is some work that myself and my colleague Jonathan Blackburn, who's the head of evidence synthesis, get his title right, and together we oversee the work of developing practice guides. And our practice guides set out the strongest evidence for leaders in children's social care, and we try to write them so that they are actionable recommendations, and they are linked directly to Children's Social Care National Framework. So the practice guides provide leaders some actionable recommendations of how they can fulfil their responsibilities within the Children's Social Care National Framework, a bit of a mouthful, and be confident that they're, robust evidence and the best available evidence at this time. So we start by conducting a systematic review. We have an expert advisory group. This includes experts by experience and leaders, practitioners, people from charities and specialist academics, and together. So it's not just me and Jonathan in a dark room writing the practice guide. We make sure that the key people who have knowledge of the different topics are supporting us through that journey. Here are some of the guides we've already published. I put the mentoring and befriending one in the middle, just because I think maybe the people who are coming to join this particular Virtual Learning Café might be sort of interested in that guide particularly, but not exclusively. Our next guide that we're just about to publish in early December will be on parenting interventions or support for parents where the children are 11 to 18. So again, maybe one to look out for. They'll be probably of interest to people joining this, but here are some others there. So really to think about the equality, diversity and equity themes from practice guides, so just digging in a little bit. And every time I'm reading the key principles, so we set the practice guides out in two sort of sections. So there's the key principles, which are from qualitative studies, how people have experienced the intervention, implementation and process. And then the recommendations are from actual interventions, named interventions. So we split the two like that. And often when I'm reading the key principles, I'm thinking, well, like, we know these things already. There's nothing that is wowing me here. But I hear time and time again that yes, we know these things, but yet they're still hard to do. They're hard because of resource implications, and all the things that you all know already. But so as I go through this, think about what you're thinking and what you're feeling in relation to some of the things that we're saying. So for example, in the kinship guide, we found that, kinship carers are saying that, they really want the support to be responsive and tailored to their specific and diverse needs and their strengths. And we learned, and this might be news, might not be, that a lot of the existing kinship carers tend to be more older grandparents, although not exclusively, and quite often economically disadvantaged. They are also, we found in the research, living with longer term health conditions, and a lot are from minoritized ethnic backgrounds. And that are the people that they are the population we know about. We know that there are numbers of informal kinship carers that we don't know about and who are not getting the support, and that's maybe another Virtual Learning Café. In terms of the parenting one, that we heard from parents that they really want practitioners to be culturally informed, and I'll talk a little bit in the book when I talk about family group conferencing about this notion of like cultural consultancy. So I'll come back to that in a bit. And this one's a long acronym. When I look at that, it always makes me think of like a New York Police Department. So, but it's not that. It's Parenting Disabled Children and Young People practice guide. So this particularly focused on parents from minoritized backgrounds, they identified parenting programs involving peer support as a real enabler to engagement for them, because it really helped them to reduce feelings of isolation and stigma. And also, like if we think about some of the work from Professor Prospera Tedam, where she talks about like the spiritual nature of some communities. I'd like you to sort of think about, when you're working with families, that, you know, what are their beliefs about disability, and what are the stories being told in families about why children might have disabilities, and how are we actually engaging in those conversations? Are we asking the questions about those beliefs? And then what does that mean for when they're asking for interventions or support that is, you know, from their peers? Some other themes were kind of access barriers that, again, throughout of these practice guides, and I'm not going to touch on each of these, but the kinship carers really felt that support on offer, we should be sort of thinking about and ensuring that support on offer is culturally sensitive, and really try to incorporate flexibility when delivering intervention. And this is one of the ones, when I sort of read it, I was like, yeah, of course we know that, but perhaps in all corners we're not able to, or we don't incorporate flexibility. And there may be many stumbling blocks, and some of them might be about resource, but some of them might be about the relationship that we hold with the kinship carers, for example. And then coming down to just the parenting one, where children are between 0 and 10, we're really sort of thinking about how we actively include fathers by addressing their unique needs. You know, how many times have we, there's a father that's always in my mind when I talk about fathers, and he said to me, you know, even when I'm in the antenatal or any sort of appointments at all, they're asking my partner how I'm feeling, and I'm standing right there. You can ask me directly, and it's really powerful. And so I think that we, you know, we can lean into that, and we can think more about how we include fathers in a way that meets their unique needs and their feelings about what it means to be in a group with other fathers. And we recently published a report on an evaluation we did on Southwark Fathers parenting program, so you can have a look at that on our website. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just picking out the parenting one, for example, this kind of parents saying, you know, this lack of cultural sensitivity, this kind of conscious or sometimes unconscious or sometimes very conscious bias and racism, meaning that parents are feeling really judged harshly by practitioners, and that the parents feeling that their own needs and experience are not carefully explored enough and met. And then thinking about mentoring and befriending, this one it'd be really interesting to get your views when we come to sort of Q&A later. A lot of children and young people from the research reported that they really wanted a mentor who was matched to their ethnicity. And what we're hearing back is, you know, that's a nice to have, and that's not always possible, and that the people who are coming forward to be mentors, who might be volunteers, or you might are not the, you know, are not people who have got, you know, who are matched to the ethnicity of the young people, or you might be living in an area where, you know, it's not as ethnically diverse. So, and then there's this question about, well, if young people can choose the ethnicity of their mentor, then what does that mean for their sort of allocated social worker and or other professional? And I think there's a different relationship there, right? So yeah, I'd be interested to kind of hear your thoughts about that one. I'm not going to dwell on this, but, you know, thinking about flexible tailored approaches and this benefits of like mixed local offer really came through in the evidence. Okay, so some sort of reflections, right? So just before I go on to talk a little bit more about the book, so thinking about, who is missing from your data and why. So when you're looking at your services, whose stories are invisible, what assumptions might you be making, and, your own positionality as well, your unique perspective, your kind of social, political, spiritual world, and how those assumptions may or may not be right or wrong, and how you're asking the families that you're working with, is your data dirty, is what I would say. Do you know what's missing from your data, or is what's in your data actually incorrect? And so there it's skewing all your kind of quality assurance endeavors. Thinking about, are your services designed for your average family or the most marginalized? And would you get a different, does that give you a different lens if you think about it in that way? Culturally informed, what does it actually mean? Who defines it? And thinking about all your co-production work, or your creating power together. I always have a problem when we talk about sharing power, because that still makes it sound like we have the power and we will share it with you. But I often talk about how can we create new power together, and your workforce, your demographics, how is that shaping the experience of families? And, particularly if you think about things that are happening recently, it seems to be like every month, but, lots of kind of unrest, the whole flag situation, grooming gangs, like are you having these conversations with people, with the families that you're working with and your workforce? And I touch on that in the book in a minute. And I've talked about fathers as well, but particularly the experience of African and Caribbean fathers, and what specifically we need to do to support them, and how we know what it is that we need to do. Often when families disengage, we know this, it's not for them to engage with us, it's for us to find techniques that engage with them. But do you see it as a family issue or a service issue? What would it mean to treat that disengagement as feedback for yourself and your trustworthiness and your cultural relevance? What is it that they're actually disengaging with? And are you prepared, as I say here, to create new power and redistribute and not just consult? And sometimes that's difficult. And sometimes we just have to be honest that this is consultation, because we can't. I remember when I was at Social Work England, we were developing Social Work England, but we can't, the regulation is regulation, and some things are kind of cast in stone in terms of legislation. So we have to just be really honest that, we are not co-designing or co-creating fully. We are more like co-designing, and being really clear. And I'm sure lots of you on this call will get this. There's a lot of conversation on social media at the moment about, panels and young people's panels and people at boards, and, has that just become a bit tokenistic, and is it time that we re-engage with some of that again, and keep that on the agenda? So that is the main, that's the bit about my work and foundations. And so when I'm not reading practice guides and trying to make the language as clean and as easy to understand as possible, I'm doing other things. And one of the things that I'm doing here is this book, The Anti-Racist Social Work in Practice, and I'll put the link. So this book is the second edition to this book, which is The Anti-Racist Social Worker, Stories of Activism by Social Care and Allied Professions. So this book came post George Floyd, in lockdown, COVID, and this was really about hearing from practitioners what they were doing, how their activism was showing up. And both Tanya Moore and Glory Simango, who are the other co-editors, we've been hearing frequently that, yeah, this is great, we loved the activism, but like, how do you do it? How do you actually do that stuff? So feels like, I can't remember how many years ago, but maybe at least a couple of years ago, we're sitting in Community Care Live in October, where lots of serious decisions are made. And I don't mean that lightly. We sat at the table where we always sit, and we said it's time to do this. It's time to do this book. So this book is more about the how-to, and it's a collection of chapters by various practitioners, Antonia being one of them, and it covers a lot of different topics. So thinking about as I just said, you know, the needs of fathers, particularly African and Caribbean fathers. Millie Kerr talks about that. There's adult social care. There's intersectionality, racism, poverty by Lisa Aldridge, and so on and so on. There's a really amazing chapter, Transformative Practice in the Criminal Justice System, which might be of interest to this audience, by Crystal Campbell-Bobb, and she's got her she's developed a model of reflection in there that I think is excellent, actually, and all the stuff that I've just spoke about on the slides would be really relevant there. But I just wanted to pick out a couple of things. So Omar Mohammed's chapter, he talks about anti-racist learning from family group conferencing with racially minoritized families. And you may know that Foundations, along with Quorum, did a trial on family group conferencing, and they're published on our website for you to have a look. And the results are very good, and we are working hard with the Department for Education to see whether that intervention can be offered sooner to families. And really, you know, let's not forget that this family group conferencing is like an Indigenous way of families being empowered and trying to kind of solve their own problems. In fact, when I was looking at this morning and just penciling some words, I was remembering a time when my cousins, my older cool cousins from Leeds, who would like they would drive like brown Datsun, this is in the 80s, and like playing, I don't know, disco or something, probably not disco, but something out, and yeah, very cool. And they were brought down to Kilburn in London, where we lived, to like have a meeting, because I was I was quite a lot off the rails, actually. And like, I hadn't really identified that until this moment, that actually that's what was happening, that this was a family meeting, and they looked for who are the people within the family network who might have some influence over them out. It didn't work, but you know, I was touched. Then they came all the way down from Leeds to try and make me see sense. So just, yeah, let's not forget that these are kind of Indigenous ways that a lot of families try to solve their problems. And what does this mean when families don't have a network, or they are dispersed, or that, you know, the extended family is very, very reluctant to get involved because suddenly they will be under the professional radar, and they've worked all their life not to be on the radar. So Omar talks about this in his chapter, and he talks about, you know, promoting children's rights, and, you know, thinking about networks. How do we build networks for families who maybe don't have a network because of, you know, stories of migration? And in it, he also talks about this term I used before of cultural consultancy, and who in your organization and who are we consulting with to learn more about individual culture and the different nuances, and can the families be our consultants? And if we were to look at it through that lens, what would it mean, and how would the relationship change? So that's a really interesting chapter, and I think relevant for lots of different areas. And then Nargis Kwayumi talks about foster carers' perspective in allyship and advocacy. You know, a gripping chapter, She talks openly about her story of migration and all aspects of social work. She talks about being care experience, being a kinship carer, going on to be a foster carer. She's now a registered social worker. And she talks about when a child was placed with her, and even though it was on her Form F, that she wouldn't have halal meat in the house, but she would, if any child was placed with her, she would make sure that, the child could like eat what they wanted and outside of the home. Anyway, you need to read the chapter to find out what happens. But it wasn't very good. And she says here, I reflected on the courage my scrawny 16-year-old self had when I admitted myself into care. I was standing up against my abuse. I was yearning for change and to be treated with basic dignity and respect. That courage was innate. I was fearless, going against my culture, my family, and breaking free from being silent. Now I was desperately seeking that little girl's courage, part of me I knew still existed. And so she talks about her fight not to be deregistered as a foster carer because of that incident, and indeed potentially using her social work registration. So 2 more things before I stop. There is also a chapter in here by Nosheen Mohammed, and this is about quality assurance and practice learning and reviewing services in quality assurance. And I won't talk about too much about it, but she really talks about how do you consider the auditor's knowledge of the subject. So this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of positionality and who is it that's actually doing the reviewing and like where are they coming from. And she says that, how do you consider the auditor's knowledge of the subject area? And if they have gaps in their knowledge about race and culture, how does this influence the audit outcome? And then she talks about how, her journey about trying to make the audit process more kind of anti-racist. And she then says, rather than having a whole big action plan, we chose one thing. And the one thing is there's one recommendation at the end of each audit. And that recommendation is, how does this align with inclusive anti-racist practice? So I would encourage you to look at that, because again, I think that the reviewing aspect is really interesting to think about, how you just like that turn of the kaleidoscope makes you sort of see things differently. And there are many, many other very interesting chapters, but I will indulge and just read the last bit from my own chapter, which is at the end, and as you might expect, it's about like evaluating what it is you're doing, thinking about your outcomes, and it's called, yes, but how do you know if anything is actually changing? So we have all these initiatives, we have action plans, we have a Gantt chart and a bar chart and all the charts, but why are we choosing to do the things that we're doing? And how do we know whether anything's actually changing? And I talk about, social work and allied professions are uniquely positioned to lean into this within your local authorities or your charities. Like, if not us, then who, right? So I'll just read this two last bits and then I'll end. So I mentioned previously about kind of global issues, local issues, and this is what I say here about national and global issues as a sort of message really to leaders and all of us. I can't overemphasize the impact that racist narratives and activities in the media, in organised far-right demonstrations, by politicians, police, teachers, in the law, in legislation, and the list goes on, has on our workforce and our families. How you do or don't acknowledge these big events in your teams, in public and or via one-to-one conversations sets the tone of how you are perceived. Don't underestimate the power of acknowledging at the start of a team meeting that there are terrible racist stories in the news at the moment. And to say that we know that it's hard to watch and hear, and have created opportunities for staff colleagues to offload, families to be heard. You might be thinking that if we did this every time, the meetings would just be taken up about talking about those things. It's sad, isn't it? If your workforce are feeling traumatized and drained, how are the people you're supporting feeling? And how are you supporting your workforce to work through some of this so they can be present for the people that you serve? And I talked there just briefly about inconsistency and injustice. This can quickly collapse if all your efforts building an actively anti-racist learning organisation, someone else in another department goes rogue and acts against the policy, and people see that there are no consequences to those actions. People make mistakes, sometimes with the best intentions and sometimes not, but how your organisation responds will make or break everything you try to do next. And the final, I keep saying that, don't I? Final thing that I'm going to say is, to those that worry that all of this diverts precious time away from working with people and families, know this is essential work that we must embrace alongside our families. And let's rise to the challenge and forward a legacy of lasting change. And if not now, then when? And if not you, then who? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nimal. I really appreciated your presentation there, and also your personal stories that you interweaved in. Have we got any questions for Nimal? I've got one. I'm going to sneak it in before anyone else raises their hand. You've reminded me, by talking about the Anti-Racist Social Worker in Practice book, of when I did my social work training many moons ago. The Anti-Racist Practice Bible was the Lena Dominelli book that you probably remember, Nimal, as well, because I know we probably trained around the same time. Have you seen any changes in terms of training for new social workers in terms of anti-racist practice, and what sort of changes, and are they for the better or not necessarily?
Yeah. Oh, I just shut my door. Hold on. So I think Antonia will be. I will invite Antonia in on this as well. So I think it's probably patchy at best. I think a lot of it, from my experience, relies on who the academic is or who the organisational development person is who is championing this work. We have regulatory standards in social work. I know that they're changing and I know they're being updated, as are the post-qualifying standards. But as with anything, there's a lot to teach, and where there are courses that are good, you can see that it's weaved in fully all the way through, and the emphasis is given on the kind of assessment at the assessment stage, and also the practice educators are supported to really kind of lean into it. But I mean, my short answer would be it's patchy. I think that whenever there is a world event, you know, and that's why we did this second book, is because we were hearing people saying, well, momentum's being lost post George Floyd. There was a big kind of lots of stuff going on, and you know, so I wonder whether now, if things are trailing off, but then you know, you've got people like Antonia in the system who are, you know, I know, championing that work. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Did you want to come in on that, Antonia?
Yeah, just to echo what Nimal said, I think it is about ensuring that it's not really one part of the system where it's a tick box or tokenistic, but it's actually weaved in throughout the entire social care program, and also with partner agencies, as social services isn't really within one part. It's not in a silo system. It's within a complex system with other partner agencies. Thank you.
Thanks, Antonia. We've got a question, Nimal, for you in the chat from Luba. How can we encourage professionals to have anti-racist values embedded from the get-go and to standardise it for the next generation of social workers, etc.?
Yeah, so I'll just read that out again to myself. The question is, how can we encourage professionals to have anti-racist values embedded from the get-go? Well, I mean, I suppose it links to what I just said. Like, well, first of all, as a social worker, you are signing up to a set of values. You've got professional standards, you've got particular things that you need to evidence in order to become a qualified social worker. And some of that is about anti-oppressive practice. And so those values that you come into the profession with, I think there is an individual responsibility not to allow that to corrode and erode. And it's hard. It's really hard when you're in systems and structures, and particularly if you're new in your career, or if you're thinking about promotion and you just think, I just want to, and you know, we've all done it. It's just want to get my head down, not raise my head above the parapet, not be seen as problematic. But then how that manifests is how you work with families. So I often used to say to newly qualified social workers, and even when I used to teach on social work programs, is, you know, this organizational gunk, you know, the kind of treacle molasses that you have to kind of wade through, is the thing that's going to get you. And that is, we can't teach that. So I think some of this is about, we should already have it embedded from the get-go, but it's really how we hold on to that and pass it on. And again, you know, thinking about Antonia, you know, your networks outside of work. So, and we say this a lot in other networks that both of us are in, is when you are having those difficult conversations and you've got a strong network of people who look like you outside of work, when you're having those conversations, you're not on your own. You're going into that, I don't know, panel or scrutiny or whatever it is, and you're speaking up and you're pointing out injustice, but you are not on your own. You know that you have your kind of sisterhood, brotherhood behind you, you know, holding you up and saying, you know, what you're doing is right. And that is how your values are sort of manifesting, I suppose.
Thanks, Nimal. We've now got a question from Patrick. Really interested to hear more of your thoughts on how national conversations shape or influence race equity in frontline work.
Well, I mean, even when I'm just thinking about the practice guides, I think there was a time in the past where I wouldn't have thought that we would have been able to centre race, particularly in the way that we can now. And so it does feel that we are moving even maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or whatever the expression is. I think it's the other way around. And also acutely aware of some of the things that I'm hearing about, you know, white working class boys, for example, and, you know, thinking about how we support them if they are minority, if they feel minority, you know, oppressed, and we put it like that. So I think that national conversations have moved, have accelerated. But I think certainly from where I sit, I think that there's a real nervousness politically about, you know, tipping the balance any one way and trying to sort of, you know, make sure that everybody's included. But we, I think, as professionals need to focus on, you know, the equity within that. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Any last minute questions for Nimal before we move on to Antonia? No? Okay. I don't know how this works, Janina, but we'll move Nimal off and then Antonia will come on.
Hello. Does this work?
Hello. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thank you so much, Gail. First of all, it's so wonderful to be here with the Youth Endowment Fund. It's amazing, really, to see organisations that are unapologetically centering race equity and anti-racism, particularly in such a politically charged world with global struggles. But I really do applaud the Youth Endowment Fund for making this a strategic priority. Also wonderful to follow after the amazing Nimal, who's doing fantastic work at What Works. And today I am just going to take you through a presentation that really focuses on how to practically embed race equity in children's services. Give me 1 minute whilst I share my slides. Okay. Can somebody please come off mute and let me know if you can see the slides?
Looks great.
Fantastic. Awesome. So it's great to be with you this afternoon. My name's Antonia Ogundayisi. I'm currently working as a service manager focused on anti-racist practice within children's services, and also support the Youth Endowment Fund around race equity advice as well. A bit about me: I have a passion for justice, particularly racial justice, but all forms of oppression is something I'm really interested in really targeting and challenging to ensure that equity is across the board, but particularly racial justice, which is often sidelined in many different realms. I've been working as a social worker for about a decade and a half. I have spanned across children's services, particularly within youth justice, youth work and fostering. I love the arts, so anything to do with, films, music, dance really excite me. I'm also a lover of long walks, but as the season changes, I need a bit of motivation. So if anyone has any tips, please let me know. I'm also an author and a writer. As Nimal shared, I have contributed to the Anti-Racist Practice Social Worker book, and I've also written journal articles as well, focused on race equity. I've supported organisations around coaching and mentoring. So for those organisations that are thinking about how do you actually start this work, and for those who are in the roles of anti-racist leads, I've also provided advice and consultancy. As mentioned, currently working within a large county council and doing some work across the Eastern region. And I'm also a researcher really focused on how to advance anti-racist leadership in children's services. So a lot of my work really spans across racial equity. What I'm hoping to really leave you with by the end of this webinar is a note on language. So when we think about race equity and racism, what do they actually mean? Those words are quite loaded, and I just want us to have a good foundation before we actually get into how to embed it. Also going to be touching a bit about children's services and how it is a complex system, and embedding racial equity within a already complex system can be challenging, but it's not impossible. Going to be looking at a few examples of systemic solutions to the issue of systemic racism, and talk very briefly about transformational leadership. It's really great to see many of you on the call today, which for me shows will and intent to be that change we want to see. And I think taking time out of our busy schedules to be a part of this is really awesome. Before we get into the mechanics, I really want us to think about the feeling that talking about race, racism, and racial equity evokes. Racism is emotional. Let's not make any mistake about it. What we're talking about evokes strong emotions, and that is loaded in a very historical context and a current context. Depending on how we were born, where we were born, how we were socialized, it will evoke different feelings in different people. And if we don't acknowledge our feelings, then it can be difficult to engage and acknowledge racism, to be honest. The histories that we inherit as well can form how we view race. For example, I was born and raised in London, in East London, and I'm of the African diaspora. I approach these conversations as a Black woman raised in London. For you all on the call, you might have been born and raised somewhere else. How does that shape how you turn up to the conversations about race and racism? Some of you on the call might be leaders, practitioners, social workers, or work with children's services. How does that shape how you, where you might be a bit more quieter in team meetings or actually speak up more? How does your personal story connect with the larger stories of privilege, exclusion, migration, and racism? I also want us to think about what helps us to feel emotionally and physically safe when we're talking about race and racism. How do we respond internally and externally? What emotions do we anticipate? And what helps us to feel grounded and connected to our own power in these spaces? As I mentioned, these words race, racism, and racial equity are loaded. Out of those three words, which word do you warm do you warm more towards? Is it racial equity because it feels much more safer to talk about that, or is it actually race, or is it racism? So what is race? Critical race theories talk about race being a notion. So it's not really a fact, it's a belief and opinion, which doesn't mean it's true, that it's a distinct biological type of human being, usually based on skin color or other characteristics. So these characteristics are usually physical markers such as eye color, hair texture, skin color. But race has also been described as a fabricated concept. Shireen Daniels is, one of the UK's leading experts in anti-racism, and she talks about how the concept of race doesn't actually exist, but it was fabricated to serve a specific purpose that dates back to the 17th century. And at that time in the 17th century was that era of European colonial expansion, the transatlantic slave trade, and early imperialism. And the purpose that it served was really to legitimize social hierarchies and unequal power relations that benefited white dominated societies. So just because it's a fabricated concept does not mean that it doesn't have real meaning in people's lives. We live in a racialized society. As those critical race theories, Delgado and Stefanik state, racism is embedded into our social norms, our legal systems, everyday practices that sustain racial inequity, even if there's no overt intent. Racism is not always conscious, explicit, or readily visible. It's often systemic and structural. Systemic and structural racism are forms of racism that are pervasively and deeply embedded in systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, and they are entrenched practices and beliefs. In the book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Renee Edo-Lodge, she talks about how racism isn't just about prejudice, it's prejudice and power, and it's reinforced through social, economic, and political systems that govern everyday lives. And there is a cost to racism, particularly for the children and families that we serve. In the chat, if you can just type in how many more times likely than other children do you think Black children are likely to be murdered in the UK than other ethnicities? Just take a guess. Just going to come back to the chat. If I can get some help by Gail or Nimal or Yanina to read out what people are writing, because I cannot see.
Steve has put 8.
8. Thank you, Steve.
Blacks 10. Anthony's put 5.5 times, multiple. There's a 5 from Sandra, 4 from Nigel. So quite varied.
Okay, thank you.
7 from Alonia, Aliona.
Thank you. The answer is 6 times more likely to be murdered in the UK than children of other ethnicities. What about exclusion rates for Black Caribbean students? Anyone have a guess how many more times higher than those of their peers? Black Caribbean students.
We've got an 8 from Sandra, an 8 from Anthony, 7 Jessica, 8 from Fiona. Quite high.
Thank you. Very, very high. They are 6 times more likely than that of their other peers to be excluded from school. How about strip search of Black children? How many more times likely do we think Black children are likely to be strip searched than other children?
Got a 10, a 7, a 5, more than 5. Luba has put adultification plays a part.
Yes. Thank you.
We've
They are
got a 12.
12. Thank you. 6 times more likely to be strip searched than other children. And strip search is literally strip search, so it's entirely stripped. How much percentage of directors of children's social care do we think are Black? How much percent are DCSs?
We've got a 1%, a 4%, 3, a 2. Low, very low numbers.
Thank you. So a little bit higher. So it's 6% of. So there's a theme here really around 6, but 6% of DCSs are Black, but that is in comparison to at least 13.3% of social workers who are working in England and Wales. So very, very underrepresented at that high decision-making table. Also, Black children wait longer than white children to be adopted. There is nothing that differentiates children except from, their skin color, their gender, their, other attributes, but it should not get in the way of if they get a fair start in life. And what is it that makes a white child more desirable to be adopted than a Black child, apart from their skin color? Children are children. And a painful figure here that Black babies are 3 times more likely to die than white babies. So before a child is actually born into the world, they don't stand. The world is already unsafe, even from the womb. And this is the painful cost of racism, of this notion that we are differentiated as human beings because of how we look, because of our hair texture, because of how wide or thin our nose is. So there's a high cost for the children and families that we serve. And when we think about problems, general challenges in the world, they can either be tame, they can either be critical, or they can be a wicked problem. Tame problems usually use 75% of the resources within the workplace. For example, if there was a practice development need within an organization, you could typically draw on the expertise of social workers, of the community, of partner agencies, and people could typically come together to say, this is how I think we should deal with it based on my experience. For critical problems, they usually demand a command and control leadership style. For example, COVID was a critical problem, and a lot of our DCSs, you would have seen them really get into motion around problem solving, coming together. But when we think about wicked problems, these are problems that are long and enduring. There aren't any clear solutions. When we think about racism, do you think it's a tame problem, a critical problem, or is it a wicked problem? If you can put that in the chat.
Steve's put all 3. And he's the only one brave enough so far to answer this one.
Thank you, Steve.
Sandra's put all 3 as well.
Thank you, Sandra.
And that's all we've got at the moment. Oh,
thank you.
Nimal has put depends who you are.
Thank you. So when we think about issues such as poverty, they would fit that definition of a wicked problem because it's long and enduring. And in this context, racism would fit the definition of a wicked problem. But I really love the fact that, attendees have put it in the category of being a critical problem as well, and a tame problem, because it's really a human issue, a heart issue. If we all actively truly saw the worth of every human being, It could be a tame issue that could be dealt with very quickly because it's a fabricated concept. But because it's a real issue, that it's a notion that has real meaning in people's lives, it's not so easy to solve, because how do you really influence somebody's heart and mind? But it does fit this definition of a wicked problem, which is a concept that Horst Rittel and his colleague Melvin Weber coined in a 1973 paper. And they use this term to describe complex, large-scale social and policy issues that cannot be solved by conventional linear methods. When we think about children's services, it exists within a complex system. Children's services is not a, it's not a silo kind of system. It's linked to so many other systems. First of all, it operates within an unpredictable and interconnected system. We work across multiple agencies: health, education, adult social care, the court system, and each system has its own rules and priorities. Depending on the family circumstances, things can change very quickly, policies and funding can shift, crises often emerge suddenly. We work in a system that is constantly changing. It's also complex because there is a silence around race and racism within child safeguarding practices. When we think about how many of us have attended this call today, I'm sure despite the advertisement and, and everything that we do in our power, this webinar should attract every single professional who is dedicated to improving the lives of children and families. The silence about race and racism is complex because professionals might fear saying the wrong thing. As Nimal described, about the training can be quite, it's not systemic or streamlined, it's quite sporadic. Sometimes people just feel uncomfortable discussing racism. It is loaded, as we talked about in that first slide, depending on who we are, where we've come from, depending on the emotional work we have done, depends on how we show up to these discussions. And people are often neutral in these discussions as well. Social work as a profession is also influenced by the resurgence of right-wing political ideologies, and these are often in tension with our own professionals' commitment to social justice. If we're seeing the media and the politicization of whether it's the flag or, the co-opting, the weaponization of a flag, which some people think represents unity, how do we manage that when we are in a profession that says we should stand up for the oppressed, that we should advocate for people? How do we do that in our social work roles on a daily basis? Social work practice itself is deeply entangled with racialized systems of oppression. It's like social work as a profession looking at itself in the mirror, and we're pointing fingers at everybody else, but our own profession has an underrepresentation of Black DCSs. Our own profession puts Black African men into fitness to practice. Our own profession doesn't talk about race, so it really does start with us ensuring that we untangle our own racialized system before we look at others. But just because it's complex doesn't mean it's not worth doing. It's actually urgent, it's critical. Every day we delay, injustice deepens. Every day we don't keep this on the agenda, the chances of our children getting good education, finding a job, receiving good healthcare, being treated justly in the youth justice system is delayed. But equity is different from equality. Equality means that we treat everybody the same. But equity means we give people what they need to thrive, even if it means that's providing different levels of support. In regards to racism, this particular house is on fire. So the way we respond to this house is going to be different at different points. In this Minnie's Acclaimed book, Ibram Kendi says there is no such thing as being not racist. We're either racist or anti-racist. And what he's saying here is that there's no point of neutrality when we're thinking about racism. Racism is not just about individual prejudice. It's not about a white person. These are about ideologies, belief systems that seep through our systems. And if we're not actively opposing them, if we're not actively opposing ideas and actions that support racism, then we are passively upholding it and upholding the status quo. But a single service approach is inefficient in addressing the complexities of racism. We need a coordinated multi-agency strategy, which is necessary. Just like if we were, targeting poverty in an area, we would need to really think about this strategically, not just looking at one area or just one part of the system. It's about thinking about it from a bird's eye view. What's going on here, and how do we pull in different agencies to do so? As I mentioned before, this work, it's urgent. There's no day that goes by that it doesn't stop being urgent. So I'm just going to talk you through my own role and how it came to be. So 2020 was a time where, we saw the horrific murder of George Floyd. And I just want to state that, I know George Floyd's murder is referenced a lot, and it was a point that created a lot of racial reckoning in a lot of people. But racism has existed for years. For those who are racialized as Black, Asian, dual heritage, on the call, this was just another event, sadly, that reinforced what we had been saying for years. But in my organization, this was a pause moment, a systemic shock moment, because not only did we see the murder of somebody, which was done intentionally, it was also COVID, so we were very much talking about death a lot in 2020. And at that time, the system sort of paused. We had senior directors, service managers who came together, and they were completely rocked basically by what had happened. They thought about their own racialized positions. A lot of them were Black and Asian and dual heritage, and they said, what can we do in our senior leadership positions? We want to do something different. We cannot have, our children and our families and our workforce sharing these stories of oppression, and we just don't do anything about it, basically. They came together, had an idea, and they said, we really want to make sure that racial equity is a strategic focus. We want to make sure that it's on the map, and they put together a business case. And this business case was that we want to have a role that is at a senior management level that focuses on anti-racism. They put together the job description. They took it to something called a Children's Transformation Board. And they said, look, we want to do this. And it was agreed. A few months later, there was a recruitment search that went out looking for, a person who would be committed to this work. And then I joined the organization in 2022. And I must say, when I saw the job advertised, I was like, no way am I doing this, because I knew it would be emotionally loaded. It's a political role. I had my own experiences of racism, and I just thought, no. But at the same time, I knew that I had been reading and rereading Black children are likely to be so and so times more likely. I was reading that, Black Asian children are overrepresented in the care system. Dual heritage children are, really, really overrepresented in multiple systems. And I thought, if I want to be the change I want to see, then I need to put myself forward and at least try. I didn't want to complain and murmur. I didn't want to basically just accept the way things were. So I applied for the role, and then I was appointed, and the project launched in 2022 in April. And I say this to say, and Nimal said it earlier, if not you, then who? And we haven't seen each other's slides. So that, to me, that really reinforces that this is the key takeaway of today. If not you, then who? You've joined this webinar for a reason. Is it a conversation you need to have with your organization? Is there somebody that you need to connect with in order to be that person that makes that change? I don't think this is about skin color. I think this is about being moral and doing the most ethical thing. And there are so many good practice. So there's so much good practice going on across England and Wales. Brighton and Hove started their journey in 2021, or even before that, where they appointed a wonderful woman called Millie Kerr, who has been doing strategic work on anti-racism since then. Norfolk have a role which focuses on anti-racism. This role began in June this year. So, they had their own time of their racial reckoning, where they said, we want to do something different. It wasn't too late. 2025 was when their journey began. So they work with a wonderful man called Abraham. I work in Essex County Council, where I've been doing this work for the last 3 years or 4 years. Hackney have a wonderful woman called Deborah Barnett, who has been doing this work since 2021, focused particularly on racial equity and inclusion. There's an anti-racist work plan being done in Wales by, I can't remember the person's name, but I also know that in Scotland, a woman called Kirsty is leading on that work. And we're doing a lot of work, which I'm leading in the Eastern region, where we have 11 local authorities that have signed up to an anti-racist pledge, ensuring that we work collaboratively to ensure this work is on the agenda. Durham also have a wonderful man called Ray doing this work. So there are people that are trying. Every local authority started with a conversation of people that wanted to do something differently. And now they are. The work is not easy. There's no quick fix, but the work has at least started. But a lot of those people that I mentioned are people who are Black and Asian. And it does have a toll. It does take a toll on our mental health. The psychological burden on Black and ethnically diverse people is huge. This work demands collective conscience and accountability. Whilst I agree that, lived experience is critical, the emotional cost and strain is immense. If you are Black, Asian, dual heritage, or a person who is ethnically diverse on the call, I want you to seriously think about your mental and emotional well-being, because you need the proper scaffolding to do this work. You need to ensure that, like Nimal mentioned, the networks are there. There's actually organizational buy-in. If you're doing it in an organization that does not want to change, then really seriously think about your own well-being. If you're not racially minoritized, then if not you, then who? This work together is possible. And I like to really summarize it in a term called transformational leadership. This leadership style was popularized by James Burns in 1978. And he was a historical and political scientist. And he talked a lot about centering ethical and moral-led leadership. And what he's basically saying is that this type of leadership style was about being ethics driven. So as Nimal said earlier as well, it's a hearts and mind thing. We can talk about the strategies, we can talk about all the tools and the practice guides, but we have to be convicted and moved and determined that we don't want the world to continue the way it's going. It's a very scary time to be alive, but what can we do based on our influence and our positions that can actually drive anti-racism as a moral imperative? This leadership style demands frequent, conscious, internal introspection, thinking about who am I, where was I born, where was I raised, was race ever discussed, what was my earliest experiences of race and racism. Once we do that internal work, then we can step out. But if we don't do that part, then the work can be inauthentic, it can become about saviorship, but it takes, that real genuine integrity to really look within and to really be moved by this work. It's really about ensuring that the voices of Black and ethnically diverse people are amplified, but without exploiting emotional labor. It's not about wheeling people out and saying, tell me about what it means to be dual heritage, because that's very dehumanizing. It's about genuinely trying to center their voices in a way that they are rewarded for, or even if you invite somebody to talk at your workplace, are they getting paid for it, or is it just, very much about exploitation? Accountability and affinity circles. Where are your spaces where you can talk about race without fear of judgment or shame? This work isn't about condemnation or shame. It's about holding ourselves to account as human beings to try and make the world better, not only for ourselves, but for the generation to come. It demands immense humility to recognize that we don't have all the answers. We're not saviors, we're not martyrs, but we're here to just stand up for those that are oppressed, those whose voices have been robbed or sidelined. How do we bring them to the center? Integrity and authenticity, ensuring that when, people of color do come and speak to us, do we truly hold their views and their voices as core? And are we authentic in what we're doing? People feel it when you're not authentic. So it's about really making sure that we are staying true to who we say we are. Tolerating uncertainty and discomfort. This work is uncomfortable. We're talking about the dehumanization, the genocide of human bodies. Of course, that will generate discomfort, but we have to tolerate it in a way where we contain ourselves so that we don't, so the work is not hindered because of our emotional stagnancy. As I've mentioned, this work is not about self-glorification. It's not about saviorship or being a hero. There's nothing to celebrate about being a hero of, dismantling systemic racism. This is simply about doing the right thing. And I have a paper coming out in December which summarizes all of this in the anti-racist leadership context, which is going to be in the British Journal of Social Work. So look out for that, which will help go into this in a bit more detail. So embedding race equity into children's services starts by first listening to and centering the voices of marginalized communities. I don't know if there's any leaders on the call, but what spaces do you have where you can genuinely hear the experiences of your staff, your children, your families that you serve? And is it a space where they feel listened to? If you know, I saw them saw them when I was out shopping and I said, you met with so and so, how was it like? Would they truly say I felt listened to, or would it just feel like a tick box? This one is a big one, strategic commitment. If your DCS, whoever is, you know, in charge of your organization does not show their buy-in, how do we hold them to account? We need to leverage their power, their influence, their authority really for this work as well. It doesn't mean that it's impossible without strategic commitment, but it does make the work 10 times harder. So leaders are really, really critical to this. Building governance structures. So what areas and structures do you have in your organization to hold the work of race equity accountable? How do you know you're making a difference? How often do you meet? Is there actually a clear strategy that is very focused? So in 5 years' time, we hope to be at so and so. In my organization, we have a clear 5-year strategy which really focuses on 12 key areas. Whether we'll achieve everything or not, I'm not sure, because you know we're still in this on this race, but it at least gives us a roadmap. Because with this work, because it cuts across every part of the system, we can end up being swayed in so many different directions. But what are the top 3 things that you can start with that are achievable and realistic? Nimal went into detail about practice guides and tools. This is really helpful for social workers. Sometimes people have the desire to be anti-racist, but they don't know where to start. But if they have a practice tool that gives them prompts that they can put in their back pocket, that they can practice in supervision, and for example, if they're going to meet a family and they had to ask about their racial identity, what questions do they ask that's appropriate or inappropriate? Practice tools really help to build the confidence of professionals. Learning spaces. How do you normalize conversations about race and racism in your organization, where you know where it's not a taboo subject, but it's something where it's a collective site of resistance, where people are talking about race and racism frequently? Again, disaggregate your data, ensuring that you know who you're talking about. Are you talking about Black Caribbean boys? Are you talking about white Irish? Are you talking about Asian Pakistani? It's about being really specific, not to reinforce that notion about race being a marker, but to actually understand that there are unique differences in communities and even within communities as well. The data would help you to know where can you target as well. Finally, I would say don't sway away from the focus. When you're doing this work, it often gets a lot of backlash. Why are we not talking about this? Why are we not talking about that? But that is all a tool to distract from the main focus. But it's really, really being clear that we are talking about racism today. We're not talking about disability. We're not talking about, although an intersectional lens matters, we're not talking about gender. We're not talking about sexism. We are talking about racism today, and being unapologetic about that. It is in the swaying from the focus that the work becomes stagnant, but how do we remain focused on it? And I'll finally end with a call to action. What conversation do you need to have? Who do you need to have it with about racial equity in children's services? What's one action you'll take this week to start that conversation? If not you, then who? Thank you very much for engaging. That has come to the end, and I hope I'm on time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Antonia. That was really inspirational. It was such a good presentation. Yeah, lots to think about. Has anybody on the call got any questions for Antonia? I'll perhaps kick off one if I may do. One of the things I was thinking about in children's services, as you know, with our work about violence prevention, is that some groups of children, particularly black children, are overrepresented, as you know, in the criminal justice system. Black children and Roma children in particular, but others as well, but underrepresented in children's service prevention services. And I think there's been quite a lot of research to look at the reasons why that is. When you're in a local authority and thinking about those sorts of things, and it's perhaps a massive question that you can't possibly answer, how do you support how do you think about how do you turn that dial in practice? How do you actually, because we know the data, we know the information, but how do we actually change things? And are those the sorts of things that you've been able to start thinking about in your role?
Absolutely. So in Essex, we call it the hub. So that's that front door. And in other organisations, I know it's called the MASH. And what we've tried to support practitioners to think about is language right at that front door. So depending on the referral, sometimes the language used is quite racist, how young people are described. Sometimes we don't actually know the ethnicity of who is actually being referred. So we really encourage practitioners to pause at that moment and to think about, where is this referral coming from? Is the language actually anti-racist or racist? And how do we ask the referrer to be reflective at that point before we actually accept the referral? Not perfect yet, and it's going to take a long time before it's normalized, but it's really about ensuring that we challenge partners from that front door to ensure that we're diverting away where appropriate and where necessary. And yeah, so I think language is a big one, really, from that front door.
Thank you. That's great. We've now got a load of questions flooding in. So the first one is from Sandra. 2 questions. One, from your experience across sectors, can you share a moment where race equity work led to a meaningful shift and what made that possible?
Yes, absolutely. So in my organisation before 2020, anti-racism, race equity was not discussed. Anything to do with race was completely invisible and silent. But since 2022, we've actually created spaces where practitioners can meet with directors directly or online. That happens every quarter, and they're able to be absolutely frank and open about their experiences, whether they think the anti-racist strategy is actually meaningful, is it making a difference? And I think what made that shift possible, where practitioners are able to have access to directors, is the director buy-in. It's their commitment, it's their willingness to listen to staff that are racially minoritized, and to ensure that the strategy feels real. It's not just tokenistic, it's not just a piece of paper, but they're actively listening. So I would say the commitment of directors, and also the courage of Black, Asian, dual heritage, particularly staff, to actually be open and say, this is how we've been feeling. So yeah, I'll say it's relational.
Thank you. We've next had a question from Luba. What's your advice for frontline workers to ensure they're also anti-racist in their practice?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it starts with the desire and heart to be. We hold them accountable to the social work standards, the standards of the profession, which says we must be anti-oppressive. And we also weave it into every part of the system. So supervision, we ensure that service managers, team managers discuss race in supervision. We ensure that there's learning spaces that occur on a monthly basis with different topics, such as, language. What does it mean to be dual heritage? What does that actually mean? We talk about stereotypes and how to ensure that we are not reinforcing it in our practice. So we have a plethora of different topics that we discuss on a monthly basis. We invite practitioners to those spaces to have real life scenarios to talk through, to ensure that they're getting that learning as well.
That sounds really good. And we've had a question from Omar. Could you please share more about senior leadership buy-in for race equity work? How is this achieved and how have you been able to keep momentum going?
Thank you, Omar. So this began actually from a senior director who was, she was the only Asian director on that senior leadership team, and she had a really good relationship with her white peers, her white counterparts, and it was really in the relationship that enabled that conversation to be had in a way that was well received and well welcomed as well. When I came into the post, I was able to meet with each of the directors. There's about 6 directors. It's a very, very big local authority. We have 1,500 staff in children and families. So really meeting them where they are at. As I mentioned again, this work is very emotional. So going with a learning mindset, with a growth mindset was really helpful as well. So understanding them more. Who are they? Where are they? How would they describe their own ethnicity? What was their social work education like? And to keep the momentum going, again, I would say it is through constant dialogue, constant constantly reminding ourselves about our why is this critical, referring back to the data to ensure that we know that this isn't just about doing something for the sake of it. There's a real cost. It's actually a financial cost as well in our children's services sectors, to the fact when we escalate children through the care system. But I would say that this work is deeply relational. It's about relationships.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, Antonia, and Nimal said as well, about having those networks, those support networks, and also looking after your mental health and well-being.
Yeah.
That's the last. Oh, we've got another one. Just popped in. So another question from Sandra. Your second to last slide touched on embedding race equity within children's services. What tends to get in the way when trying to embed race equity into everyday decisions and service pathways?
Yeah, I think active resistance sometimes to this work. Not everybody wants to see a racially equitable world. So we can never control hearts and minds. It has to come from within. So I think for those in position of power who don't want to do this work, who find this work draining or irrelevant, it can be hard to maintain momentum in those with those people. Also, I think this work also evokes a lot of fatigue in people sometimes. As I mentioned, this work is emotional, so in order to keep going, you need to keep tapping into the emotional aspect sometimes of oneself. People do burn out along the way. People don't have the long-term stamina needed for the work as well. Again, as I mentioned, social care is within a complex system, so financial strains, cuts, all of those things can influence funding, more people being able to be dedicated to the role. So it's definitely multifaceted, but I would say it is complex. It's not one hindrance. But I would say hearts and minds is probably the biggest, because if we all decided to, things could change tomorrow.
Yeah, very true. Okay, we've come to the end of the session. Once again, thank you so much, both Antonia and Nimal, for their presentations. I hope you've all found it as thought-provoking and inspirational as I have done. As I said at the beginning, the recording and both sets of slides will go on the website, so please feel free to get on the website, look around and pull them off there, and to share them with any colleagues that you think would find it helpful. So thank you, Antonia and Nimal, again. Great to see you this afternoon, and hope you've all enjoyed it. Nimal's just put a link in as well for the Anti-Racist Social Worker in Practice book that came out with the chapter from Antonia as well as Nimal. And I think Omar on the call has got a chapter in there as well, which is great. Thanks, everybody, and have the rest of the afternoon. Have a great afternoon.